Hi, welcome back to Celebrating Culture. We're here today at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana, with Dr. Robert Citino. Welcome to the show.
Charles, thanks for having me.
The World War II Museum has just done a phenomenal job in New Orleans. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the museum is coming up on 20 years old, but you wouldn't know it. It looks like it's been here forever. It's as fulsome and rich a cultural experience as you're ever going to get. And I personally know of no museum in America, or perhaps in the world, that has grown like this one. You know what that tells me, Charles? There's people who are into the idea.
And the construction that's going on is
it's
still growing.
I've been here 3 years. There's been constant new construction in the 3 years I've been here, but in the years before that, when I'd come speaking at the museum, I was a university professor. It's like there was a new building here every year. This place never sleeps.
And it started out as the D-Day Museum.
So we started out as the D-Day Museum, just dedicated to June 6, 1944, the big landing in Normandy. The idea was to have a museum on the lakefront. Pontchartrain, of course,
sure,
for those in the audience. And that would memorialize Andrew Higgins, who was a shipbuilder here in New Orleans, who built those famous Higgins boats. You know, the ramp comes down, troops charge off, if you think of Saving Private Ryan. So it started as a D-Day museum, but soon it was obvious there was interest in having a museum that would take us through America's entire experience in what we call the war that changed the world.
We just had D-Day 75. Tremendous success.
So we had a set of D-Day 75 events. I like to call them home and aways, because we did a big deal here on campus. We had veterans, maybe 60 World War II veterans. We had staff involved. We had music. We had various kinds of memorializations. And that was big enough. That would have satisfied most museums. But our museum, we also took 2 ships of travelers over to Europe, guests who wanted to experience D-Day 75 on the site.
2 ships.
Yeah.
How big were the ships?
2 ships. Well, I can't detail
How many
the
people,
specs,
though?
but yeah, there are 450 people on each ship. So we came close to 1,000 visitors, and about another 30 World War II veterans on those 2 ships, many from the Normandy campaign. Wow. So Charles, I always put it this way. 16 million men and women put on the uniform in World War II for the United States. Less than 500,000 are left. I know I say that to people. What does that mean? It means about 3% of those who fought are still alive. 97% of that generation has passed. So if you gather 100 veterans in today's environment, given the actuarial tables and their advanced age, I think you're really doing something. We're pretty proud of that.
Wow, and then you also do the American Spirit Awards. It seems like you want to educate the youth, because the youth are there for that event as well.
American Spirit Awards is about going beyond just the war and thinking about what was it that allowed America to triumph in this global conflict. And sure, we're rich, we have huge factories, we have production, we have brilliant scientists. Those things are all given, but you know, a lot of countries are rich and have brilliant scientists. I think what America was able to experience in World War II was a kind of sense of national unity that is a bit rare for us because we're a democracy and we argue with one another for a living. That's what we do.
We do. And we do that very well sometimes.
And we do it very well. We're experts at it. But there are times when the country comes together, obviously, and World War II was one of those times. When we say American Spirit Awards, I'm thinking of unity. I'm thinking of putting that higher purpose above your own goals.
In line with that, this year you had Captain or Uncle Wiggly Wigs.
Yes. So this is Air Force officer named Halverson, who was also known as the Candy Bomber.
Yes.
So a little bit of background. There was a crisis after the war, and the Soviets had surrounded Berlin and were not letting flights or any kind of supplies into this huge, sprawling city of Berlin. And, America decided not to attack, not to launch a war, but to launch its Air Force to drop supplies into Berlin. And one of the pilots knows that was there landing a crowd of little kids on the ground. He started parachuting candy out of the plane, known as the Candy Bomber. I like, look, every country has this image of itself at its best, right?
Right.
And to me, candy bombing. That's what this country's all
It was
about.
so creative, it was.
There are kids who grew up in Berlin. They'd be older now, right? They'd be over 70 now. They remember that. They said it wasn't just candy; it was hope. First you don't know where your next meal's coming from. Then that's being taken care of, and then there's always also somebody thinking of giving candy to the kids.
That was so incredible because of the creativity where he saw a need that was, you've got your job to do.
Yeah.
But he thought out the box and said, we can do a little more.
Yeah. I sat next to him at our American Spirit Award dinner. I had a nice long conversation. I've been telling my students, I was a university professor for 3 decades. I've been telling my students about the Candy Bomber forever. There I was in his presence. Big moment for me.
I got to meet him as well,
Yeah.
for me too. And also a Tuskegee Airman.
Tuskegee Airmen, of course. This is the famous African-American unit. Crack pilots flying those P-51 Mustangs with the red tail coloration, so they were known as the Red Tails. America had its racial problems at the time, and this is still an officially segregated military. So blacks and whites were kept apart from one another, as if there was something unnatural about having them in the same unit. Thankfully, we've moved beyond that, but I'll tell you, if anyone thought that African Americans couldn't fight, couldn't get the job done, anybody had that mistaken notion, one look at the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails in World War II, would make you realize how ridiculous it was.
I was impressed, and he's turning 100 on Pearl Harbor Day this year.
Yeah, I was with, was in Normandy with, as I say, 30 World War II veterans, so they're all in their mid-90s, and they're running rings around us. They have more energy and more stick-to-itiveness than any people I've ever seen, so they had the right stuff back in '44, and they still do.
And there was a spy on this year's awards, a woman. She told a story about how she would go to the Germans and say she's looking for her fiance.
Yeah.
And because she could pass off as being German, and they would say, oh, he's in a tank, and the tanks are over in that forest. And then she would radio that in, and they would go bomb the tanks.
So let's just say this too. We talked about the Red Tails. If anyone thought women couldn't get the job done, if you had that mistaken notion, they were all over World War II. Not in frontline combat positions. The country didn't handle it like that at the time. But victory in World War II is impossible to conceive of without American women.
Absolutely. And now we're in the room here about the Hump, and I see the P-40. So tell us about General Chennault and the China campaign.
So we have this magnificent flying tiger over my head. It's called that because of a painting on the engine cowling, those fierce-looking teeth. You know, this takes a certain amount of sort of backdrop. The Japanese are launching a vicious war of conquest into China in 1937, so we're talking 4 years before Pearl Harbor. And the Chinese are reeling back in some disarray, but China has friends in the United States, and one of them is a retired Air Force officer, actually, U.S. Army Air Corps. There was no independent Air Force yet, by the name of Claire Chennault. He went and flew for the Chinese under contract, like $1,000 a month for 3-month contracts that he signed on a rotating basis. He and some of his retired friends, and he taught Chinese pilots how to handle some new modern equipment. He put together a kind of primitive early warning system. So look, we're looking at high tech right now, 1938 style, right? But China was a country with a barely developed infrastructure. If you could use the word primitive, not for the people, of course, but for the conditions in China, I think it's probably accurate. So kind of a complicated system of pennants and flags that would tell flyers when the Japanese were 30 minutes out, 15 minutes out, when it was time to scramble the planes, when it was time to get aloft. I've often thought that that's how you have to make war if you're high tech and you're campaigning in a low tech environment, man, you got to be clever. And Chennault had it. He came back to the States and sold Washington on this. He said, look, Japanese are our strategic adversary. China's our ally, and the Japanese are wreaking havoc over there. We have to do something about air power for the Chinese. And that turned into, from kind of an improvised effort on Chennault's part, to an officially sanctioned American Volunteer Group, AVG, but better known to everybody, of course, once again, as the Flying Tigers. I think they were, it's tough to say that they were the difference between victory and defeat. They played a major role in China being able to survive the Japanese onslaught. That's the way.
Well, and the numbers I heard, I mean, were unbelievable kill ratio to planes they lost.
The Japanese have a very, very swift little fighter plane. We know it as the Zero. They didn't call it that, of course, but the Zero. It's maneuverable, and it's fast, and it's light. But this Hulk above me could really dish out and accept a lot more punishment than the Zero could. American pilots were good enough, and the equipment was good enough, and sometimes even better than that. And I think the Japanese soon found that what they had uncontested control of the air, now suddenly they were fighting for every bit of airspace, and that was all the difference.
Now, I also heard that he had tactics. General Chennault, I believe the wingman theory, you go up in pairs, and they were very successful. We still use some of that today.
Everybody knows the wingman theory today. Matter of fact, you say it when you go out at night. You're going to be my wingman?
That's right.
Are you going to take care of me? Everybody knows the wingman theory, but none of this stuff was just born out of the whole cloth. Someone invented it. And when most of our air tactics that we use still today were invented was the 1920s and 1930s. So from 1918 to 1938, 20 years, right? But think of a 1918 aircraft. It's made of wood and cloth, and it's held together with wire and glue. Biplanes and sometimes triplanes. Now we have these sleek, low-wing monoplanes, like you're looking at upstairs here. And it's like going, I think, I don't know, it's like going from a Model T to a space shuttle or something in terms of the technological jump. So how to use it, how to employ it, that all had to be worked out on the fly. And it was guys like Chennault who were doing it.
And then also the Hump.
Yeah.
I mean, they used to defend the Hump as well, the cargo planes?
So you talked about the Hump here. What the Hump is getting over the Himalaya mountains. It's flying supplies from Burma, controlled by the Americans and the British, into China over the Himalayas. It's one of the most dangerous flights you could possibly imagine. There's a huge updraft, and that'll kill you. And then there's a huge downdraft, and that'll kill you if you're not a very skilled and very attentive pilot, and if your plane doesn't experience any kind of failure. So P-40s and this aircraft and others like it would accompany those transport flights at least part of the way over the hump to make sure that they were not interfered with by Japanese aircraft. But let me just say this. Americans know D-Day, Americans know the Battle of the Bulge, Americans know Midway. There's certain iconic battles. The Hump and the CBI, China, Burma, India Theater, have never gotten the attention they deserve.
But John Wayne did make a movie.
Well, John Wayne made a movie about it, and that might be good enough. But I'm really proud that here at the museum, we have this entire rich, fulsome gallery dedicated to the CBI because hundreds of thousands of U.S. servicemen were there. I've met many of them, and they always say what I just said. Yeah, no one ever thinks about the CBI. But I'm glad to say here at the National World War II Museum, we definitely do.
And this exhibit is phenomenal, what you've done in bringing actually a P-40 Warhawk in.
Yeah.
And I'm proud to say the University of Monroe now honors the P-40 as their mascot.
So you have a hawk. What's the mascot? You have a hawk and a flight jacket.
Yes.
Oh, there you go. So just for the record for our audience, there is no such thing as a warhawk in nature, but there is a warhawk.
I was fooled for a few months there on that. I have to admit that.
That's good.
But I'm glad to see that a university took honoring veterans and that effort as their mascot, because then their students have to ask, well, who is this? Is this a bird?
Yeah.
And, they have to learn that.
I taught university for 32 years before I came to the museum as the senior historian, so 80s into 2016. And I'll say this, there's a continued, sustained high level of interest among students in World War II. We sometimes hear, well, they don't teach it at this school, they don't teach it at that school. Well, they ought to, and everyone should teach World War II, and everyone should know something about it. It's, maybe along with the U.S. Civil War, it's the most crucial 4 years in modern American history. The country you live in today was determined by World War II. So here's a plug for all those who are out there teaching World War II.
And in the museum here, this is a very large area dedicated to I'd say the Hump, the China part.
Yes. We have a relief map of the Hump, which you can kind of trace, the exact route that the pilots would take. We have artifacts from the flyers, and of course, trumping them all is this big baby over my shoulder.
Also, General Chenault retired to Monroe, Louisiana, and they've put together a museum there as well.
A very fine museum, and I would urge all our viewers to get out to Monroe and to see the Chenault Museum, and while you're in beautiful Louisiana, don't miss the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans.
Robert, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of Celebrating Culture.